So now we would like to welcome Reverend Titus Presler, who's going to help us take a look at overcoming obstacles about evangelism. As members of the body of Christ, we are called to verbal proclamation of the good news. To incorporate proclamation in our pilgrimage in the way of love is to fully live into God's mission. Titus will share his wisdom and insights as we gather to consider the words heard and exchanged in today's workshops. There may be still more questions than answers in our midst, but we will be reminded that our journey in faith has the sharing of stories at its core. You can prepare by reading the essay Evangelism ? Tackling the roots of Episcopalians' reluctance in the living church. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And it's a real pleasure to be with you all this afternoon and to be at this conference. And at the outset, I just want to note how remarkable it is that this regional and church-wide conference has been put on by a parish, and not a huge parish, right down here in southern Vermont. Really an extraordinary offering to the church as a whole, and I just commend all the many people who've been so instrumental in bringing that together. This morning, Jerusalem began by saying that she wanted to move from head to heart. Well, in fact, in the midst of her presentation, she, from my perspective, integrated head and heart very nicely. There was a real heartfelt appeal at the same time that she was offering some very solid theology. I would say that I'm seeking for a similar integration of head and heart, but I might be moving a little bit more to head. But nevertheless, all the while seeking to integrate head and heart in the sense that Episcopalians' reluctance about verbal proclamation arises not so much primarily from head issues as it is from a kind of heart reluctance and shyness. But that heart reluctance and shyness is rationalized by various intellectual propositions. And it's those intellectual propositions that I'm seeking to dismantle, to challenge, to deconstruct this afternoon with you. I want to begin with the baptismal promise, similar to where Jerusalem Greer began this morning. Will you proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Jesus Christ? Will you proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Jesus Christ? Episcopalians say yes to that. I will at every baptismal service, at every recitation of the baptismal covenant. But in most Episcopalians' minds, there is a ready affirmation of example, but a reflexive reluctance about word. So there's a sense, an assumption that we proclaim by example, but not in word. Why is that? Episcopalians labor under numerous negative characterizations of evangelism and verbal witness. And you heard, again, Jerusalem Greer testifying to the abuse, as she termed it, the abuse of evangelism in her growing up in the Southern Baptist Convention in Arkansas. And you're familiar with all kinds of experiences that you've had, people shoving tracts into your hands. Over lunch, Lindsay Huddle, who's a member of the Green Mountain Witness team, noted that she had a friend, I can't remember at what stage of life, who used to ask her repeatedly, "Have you been saved?" And the friend would not accept her answer and would not really entertain her affirmation that in fact she had been saved as an Episcopal Christian. And then I observed that Michael Curry, our presiding bishop, is someone that everyone delights in. Isn't he so inspirational? From my perspective, Michael Curry is probably the most outstanding presiding bishop the Episcopal Church has ever had. He is unmatched in his enthusiasm. He is unmatched in his zealous proclamation of the gospel, but he is also a very serious theologian. He puts it all together in a marvelous way. Everyone loves what Michael Curry says, but they don't follow his example. Because they are not, they listen to Michael Curry and they go back and continue to refuse to witness to Jesus Christ in word, and to take refuge in the affirmation that they are simply witnessing to Jesus Christ by their example. So in contrast to that, I want to repeat, very much as Jerusalem did this morning, the Episcopal Church's understanding of evangelism. Evangelism is the spiritual practice. That is to say, it's not a program, it's not a mandate, it is a spiritual practice, an orientation to God and to the world. I would characterize that orientation as an orientation of transparency. Being transparent to the presence of God in one's life, transparent to the presence of God in the world, transparent to the presence of God in the lives of others. It's a spiritual practice of seeking, naming, and celebrating Jesus' loving presence in the stories of others. As Jerusalem said this morning, and I wrote it down, that little slogan, Episcopal Evangelism, is the sacred art of sharing story. And by the way, I want to just honor and treasure some of the stories that we've heard today. Jerusalem's stories, of course, but also the stories offered by Susan Olidahl and Marilyn Ward about pub theology over in St. Johnsbury. And then what Marilyn Ward is doing in laundromat ministry down in Worcester, Massachusetts. Just extraordinary, edifying, inspiring stories of what God is doing through their ministries. So seeking, naming, and celebrating Jesus' loving presence in the lives of others, and then inviting them to more. At the 2019 annual meeting of the American Society of Missiology, we were listening to Ron Sider, which is a name that some of you may recall from a number of decades ago, the author of Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, and the founder at the time of Evangelicals for Social Action. So he was trying to bring evangelicals to a place where they weren't only doing evangelism, but were affirming and engaging in social action, and was eminently successful in that. And I can testify to the fact that the evangelical world is probably just as interested in social justice today as the mainline churches. And at this conference, Ron Sider was coming back to this gathering of missiologists from all denominations, all around the country and all around the world, and encouraging people to engage in evangelism. I asked a question, I can't remember what my question was, but I stood up, and in that assembly of about 250 missiologists, I shared this Episcopal understanding of evangelism, that it is the spiritual practice of seeking, naming, and celebrating Jesus' loving presence in the stories of others, and then inviting them to more. And there was this audible sigh of admiration throughout this assembly at the Episcopal Church's understanding of evangelism. So I just want to put that before you again as an encouragement to take that as a unique and I want to say a blessed understanding of evangelism on which you can base your practice, your spiritual practice in the world. And notice also the emphasis on Jesus. David Saul in the previous session was just talking about how there's the question, what is it that distinguishes the work of the church from the work done by all sorts of social agencies, by the Rotary Club, by the Lions Club, and so on and so forth? And yes, it is, in fact, the presence of Jesus Christ, the action of God in Jesus Christ in the life of the cosmos. So let's analyze, and I just came up with this little neologism today. Let's analyze Episcopal evangelophobia. Episcopal evangelophobia about proclamation by word. And I think you have this outline in front of you, 10 theses. I'm going to go through these 10 theses about Episcopalians' evangelophobia. So first, I want to say that Episcopalians' reluctance about verbal proclamation is linguistically nonsensical. The very word to proclaim comes from the Latin verb clamare, which means to cry, and proclamare means to cry out. That is to say, it is a verbal event. It is a verbal event. So proclamation is inherently verbal. Yeah, we can use it metaphorically. Yes, we're proclaiming through our good deeds and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, we can't get away from the fact that we are called to proclaim verbally. And proclaim what? Evangelion. Here we go to the Greek. Evangelion, which means good news. You're familiar with euphony, which is a pleasing sound, euphonious, various kinds of EU words. The EU means good. Evangelion has to do with a message. And from that, we have the word angel. Why? Because angels are people who bring messages. So Evangelion was good news, which is to say, I used to be a newspaper reporter. And what do newspaper reporters do? What do you go to the news for? You go for stories. The news is all about stories. In fact, in the trade, we call, I'm working on a story. A story, that is to say, a narrative. The gospel of God in Jesus Christ is not a philosophy. It's not a principle. It's not an action plan. It's a narrative. It's a story. And a story requires what? That it be told. If there's a great event in your family, here's Stefan with these wonderful twins that he and Thomas have together, okay? You've all seen the twins. Well, when they were born, when they came to you, what did you do? You told everyone. You began making telephone calls. You began texting, you began emailing, you probably put it on Facebook or Instagram or somewhere. That's to say, news requires telling. The gospel is a story. We can't get away from that. We need to rest in that and sink deeply into that. It's a narrative. It's not your philosophy. It's not your set of principles. It's the narrative of what God has done in the cosmos. In the cosmos, not simply this world, not simply the human story. In the cosmos, the cosmic Christ, as Richard Rohr calls him. The cosmic Christ, what God has done in the cosmos in Jesus Christ. And we have been blessed with that narrative, and that narrative requires telling. It's a story. So first of all, Episcopal evangelophobia is linguistically nonsensical, because the gospel is a story that needs telling. Secondly, it is historically amnesiac. You know what an amnesiac is? It's someone who wakes up and can't remember. Well, I think we as 21st century Christians often act as though we were amnesiacs about our own Christian history. Word and deed were equally prominent in the ministry of Jesus. You cannot reduce the ministry of Jesus to a set of good works. The average Christian, the average person in the street can tell you any number of things that Jesus did and any number of things that Jesus said. Now, it also suggests to you that in the gospel accounts, it is very striking that Jesus' mighty works are almost always accompanied by mighty words. Think of the paralytic whom Jesus raised. I ask you, is it easier to say, get up and walk, or to say, this person's sins are forgiven? The woman at the well in Samaria. Any number of Jesus' good works. Think of the healing of Jairus' daughter. Think of the healing of the servant of the centurion. I tell you, not in all Israel have I seen such faith as this. That's to say, there's not only the fact that Jesus spoke as well as worked, but his works were always accompanied by mighty words. And the words illuminate the works. The works illustrate the words. Likewise, throughout Christian history, verbal witness has been inherent in the life of the church and in the witness of Christians throughout the ages, whether in the rest of the New Testament or in the early church or throughout the medieval period or in the life of the modern church. Verbal witness has been a part of the Christian DNA. So how is it that we can arrogate to ourselves the notion that somehow example is enough and that we don't need to say anything? We don't need to share the word, the narrative of the gospel. Third, again, in a historical vein, reluctance about verbal proclamation is genealogically disrespectful. Genealogically disrespectful. How many people here are Christian because of an adult conversion? Okay. And I certainly had an adult recommitment. How many people here inherited Christian faith from your parents? The vast majority, okay? So you may feel as though there was a time when you were never a Christian. But sometime in your family history, someone heard the narrative. Sometime in your family history, someone heard the story and affirmed the story as the definitive cosmic event, and they became Christians. To affirm that they valued the story and then not to value it yourself. To affirm, to realize that they told the story, but then declined to tell the story yourself. You can see there's a disconnect between your own genealogical faith history and your own life of witness today. Fourth, reluctance about verbal proclamation is analytically reactionary. Analytically reactionary. And here we come into contact with all of the critiques of evangelism. Yes, Christian gospel has been at various times spread by military conquest. Yes, at various times missionaries have disrespected indigenous religions and some of the great religions of the world. Yes, at various times Christian witness has been linked with colonial projects. Yes, at various times in our own day, evangelism has been abused by fundamentalist Christians. But is that a reason to draw away from verbal proclamation altogether? As I say in the outline, it's a little bit like dismissing the entire field of medicine because of some quacks. Dismissing the entire field of medicine because of various claims that people are making about solutions to the COVID pandemic that have no basis in science. Of course not. And so this kind of reflexive rejection of evangelism is often, as I say, analytically reactionary. Fifth is liturgically inconsistent. And here we come really onto Episcopal ground. It's amazing, our Episcopal liturgy. You know, we go into church and we encounter this deluge of eloquence. I mean, first of all, we have the prayer book, which is, you know, one of the great masterpieces of the English language, and a source of inspiration by, you know, in many other Christian denominations as they're looking around for prayers for this and that. And then we have the scriptures. And unlike many Protestant denominations, we don't just listen to one scripture. We have 3 scriptures, an Old Testament lesson, an epistle, and a gospel, and a psalm. And then we have a sermon, which may or may not be eloquent. But you know, it's a verbal event. And then there's the hymnody, and then there are the prayers. I mean, just this wonderful deluge of verbal events. And we glory in that. As Episcopalians, we're proud of that. We treasure that. We cherish that. And then we go out into the world and we are silent. We go out into the world and we are silent. All of that praying, all of that eloquence is to equip us with a verbal infrastructure within our hearts and minds and spirits such that we have a way of expressing what God is up to in the cosmos. But we go out into the world and we're silent. You see the inconsistency there. Some parishes have a sign on the inside of their outer door that says, "Now you are entering your mission field." But many Episcopalians don't act like that. They go out into the world and they are silent. So reluctance about verbal proclamation is liturgically inconsistent. And I say liturgically inconsistent because in the other side of our mouth, we want to say, oh, we're worshiping in what we do in the world. I'm worshiping in my nursing care. I'm worshiping in my teaching. I'm worshiping in my technology work. I'm worshiping in my agricultural work, whatever the case may be. But then we are verbally silent. That cannot be. Sixth, reluctance about verbal proclamation is cognitively incoherent. Cognitively incoherent. You can tell that this is more a head trip than it is a heart trip, okay? But again, what I'm trying to play out are these various mental rationalizations for our heart reluctance. Cognitively incoherent. Human thought takes verbal form. We have instincts, we have intuitions, but it's so interesting that human memory does not really begin to take hold until verbal facility takes hold. And of course, child psychologists and neuroscientists and so on are all still trying to explore and understand the nature of children's thinking. The nature of Stefan and Thomas's, 7-month-old twins. What's going on in there? I have a 6-month-old granddaughter at the moment, and I'm always wondering what's going on in there. Memory begins. I don't know about you, but my own memories begin at about the age of 4 or 5. And it's not incidental, it's not coincidental that memory is related to verbal facility. So our thinking takes verbal form. So then the question becomes, are Episcopalians silent about their faith because they don't know what they believe? Now, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, Mark Priest, who's a rector here in Vermont. Where is Mark located? It's over near White River Junction. Anyway, over there in southeastern Vermont. Mark Priest notably stands that on his head. He says, no, Episcopalians don't know what they believe because they don't talk about it. Okay? They don't know what they believe because they don't talk about it. I'm sure there are poets in the room. I'm sure there are essayists in the room. When you sit down to write, do you have it all planned out in front of you? No. You have an intuition. You have some set of ideas that you want to pursue, but the form they take arises in the creativity. I mean, I was sitting down to really sketch out what I was going to say today. And it was in the course of this week that this neologism occurred to me, evangelophobia. That didn't happen until I was at the computer, okay? Which is to say that we think through speaking. And through speaking, we are then able to clarify what we are thinking. So that sharing your faith story helps you to really get a sense of what your faith story is. Sharing your convictions about God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and what God is up to in the world helps you to clarify your theology. I don't know about you, but when I've in the past helped someone come to a sense of faith in their lives, and that's happened a number of times, oh my word, do I get a rush? Do I get a sense of a vivid realization of the reality of God in my life as another person comes to faith through my witness? 7, Episcopalians' reluctance about verbal proclamation is culturally conformist. It's culturally conformist. We Episcopalians and Anglicans often pride ourselves how non-conformist we are, okay, and how edgy we are. You know, we'll press the envelope on what's, you know, suitable conversation. We've got interesting artistic tastes. You know, we're into all the edgy movies. We're into, you know, articles in the New Yorker, and you know, we're on the cutting edge. But when it comes to talking about faith, we are culturally conformist. You know the old adage, sex, money, sex, politics, and religion, not suitable for polite company. Well, it's not too hard to talk about sex. It's not too hard to talk about politics, except maybe now, post-Trump, etc. But to talk about religion, to talk about your faith, that is kind of taboo. That's kind of verboten. That's, you know, we've consented to this artificial American idea that faith is part of the private sphere, not part of the public sphere. And we've taken that into even what's acceptable in conversation. And I want to say that is a capitulation to the prevailing culture and a sign of our cultural conformity, not our nonconformity. Are we willing to buck the culture in terms of speaking about matters of faith? 8, Episcopalians' reluctance about verbal proclamation is ecclesially establishmentarian. Ecclesially establishmentarian. This has to do with the established church. And we inherit this from the established Church of England, which, as you know, the Queen is the head of the Church of England, okay? And she needs to consent in the appointment of all the bishops, and especially the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, we don't have establishment in the Episcopal Church, but we have inherited the ethos of establishment. That is to say, we often tacitly have this sense that we are it, okay? We are kind of the standard. We are the norm. After all, we have the Book of Common Prayer, which is this classic of the English language and such a standard of liturgical prayer throughout so much of the English-speaking world. We're it. So how can these other people not get it that we're it? And this even comes into our sense of welcome. You know, we love our Episcopal signs. The Episcopal Church welcomes you. And it is very important to be welcoming. But simply welcoming people is not evangelism. How many vestry conversations have you been a part of about evangelism that basically boil down to, well, let's do something about the church sign. Let's make our bulletin more accessible. Let's kind of do a digest of the liturgy so that people don't have to go to page 355 or page 78 or whatever the case may be. No, that's not evangelism. That is welcome. Evangelism is going out beyond the boundaries of the church to reach those who are struggling about God, who are struggling about their place in the cosmos that Christ has entered. Even the very fashionable radical welcome that we talk about today, and I want to give due credit to Stephanie Spellers and her book, Radical Welcome, and the importance of that. Yes, indeed. But radical welcome is not evangelism. Evangelism means, and what's frightening about that? You see, welcome leaves us in the majority. When we're welcoming people into our congregation, we're welcoming a minority, 1 or 2 people, 3 or 4, maybe 5 on a Sunday, into our 25 or 35 or 85 or 185, whatever the case may be. So they are the minority. We are being magnanimous. in welcoming this little minority into our majority. But when you're out in the world and you're thinking about maybe talking about Jesus, you are a minority in this vast majority of people who may be hostile to the gospel, are not interested in the gospel, may dismiss you, may reject you. You know, the last session was talking about dealing with the fear of failure. The earliest Christian communities were a tiny minority. And by the time Constantine affirmed Christianity in 313, something like 60% of the Roman Empire was evangelized, and maybe 40% was Christian, because this tiny minority went out and had the courage to evangelize this great pagan majority who were part of any number of religions. Ninth, Episcopal reluctance about verbal proclamation is interreligiously isolationist. Interreligiously isolationist. Today in the 21st century, I want to say that we're facing three great global challenges. One is the challenge of poverty. The second is the crisis of climate justice. And the third is interreligious conflict. Obviously, between Christians and Muslims in various parts of the world, including in North America, between Hindus and Muslims, between Buddhists and Muslims and Christians in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka. And so that environment of interreligious conflict can make us reluctant to engage interreligiously because we don't want to offend. We don't want to dismiss. Well, you can have a conversation without offending and without dismissing. You can have a conversation that is based on exploration and the search for mutual understanding. We live in a time of a cacophony of voices about every conceivable subject on the internet and elsewhere. Why cannot we contribute to that conversation? In other words, what's needed is not silence, but eager and humble conversation toward understanding and towards reconciliation. So interreligious conflict is not a legitimate reason to avoid sharing your faith. In fact, people of other faiths who are not so affected by the privatization of religion in the United States, they're often eager to talk about their faith. I mean, I've had wonderful conversations with Baha'is, with Buddhists, with Muslims, with Hindus. They love to talk about faith. You don't need to worry about offending as you approach that with a spirit of exploration and humility. And then 10th and finally, Episcopal reluctance about verbal proclamation is missionally incomplete. Episcopalians' mission today generally narrows to poverty alleviation, which obviously is crucial. But Jesus' mission was holistic. As Mark says, he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. To proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And so finally, I want to say, I bring in this category of integrity. By integrity, I don't mean honesty. I mean integrity as engineers use the term integrity. We're in this whole infrastructure debate in our national conversation right now. And so there's the issue of the integrity of bridges, okay? Are the bridges constructed in a way that the struts hold up the roadway? Are they mutually supportive? And I want to say, we need to look at that kind of integrity in our Christian witness. Someone this morning in the question time raised this crucial word of witness. You shall be my witnesses, says Jesus at the Ascension in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. You shall be my witnesses. Witness in word and witness in deed. Those mutually support the structure of our witness. And with that, I conclude my remarks and invite your questions and points of discussion.
Hey, Titus, thank you very much. I sort of feel like adding an addendum to your wonderful 10 theses. And that has to do with overcoming the potential of still sitting here and going, yes, but how shall I speak? Where shall I speak? When shall I speak? I've been working as a hospice chaplain for a little while, and one of the learnings that I've had is I go into a variety of situations, many of which are people who are really quite apprehensive about somebody who might be religious sitting in their midst in a very tender moment in their lives or their family's lives. And so the first thing that I do is listen.
Yeah.
So open a space where the other person can express where they are, who they are, what their great hope is, where they find meaning. And then forensically, sort of listening to what they are saying and try to discern ways in which the message of Jesus and Jesus's love, reconciliation, and grace are actually already taking place. And then that's the spot where sometimes not pointing it out directly, but just try to redirect the person's thoughts and views so that it's really the other person who is in control of that very situation that we are so afraid of. What do I say? What do I do?
Yeah.
They become the drivers of that.
Yeah.
And so all we have to do then is respond with what we already know and make them aware that they are maybe not so far away from us as they may have thought.
I affirm everything that you've said, John, absolutely. And there's a way in which this workshop is kind of at the wrong end of the conference. It should have been before the other workshops, because the other workshops have been so wonderful in the how. And I'm not really directing my remarks to the how. I've got this narrow agenda of tackling the so-called intellectual objections to evangelism. But you're absolutely right that it begins with the listening. And here's the genius again of the Episcopal definition. It's the spiritual practice of seeking, naming, and celebrating. And that begins with listening and listening deeply. And speaking of the New Yorker, I picked up my New Yorker on the way down yesterday, and there's this wonderful wonderful cartoon. Here's a man and a woman at dinner, okay, obviously in a restaurant, and they've each got a wine glass in their hands. And she says to him, "Thanks. I knew I could count on you to turn my problem into something way worse that happened to you." And of course, it's the man who's the dumb cluck here. Listening to people's stories without colonizing them, listening to people's stories without just making them part of our own story and building on their story in order to tell our own story. No. Need to listen deeply to the dynamics, to the anguish, when I was a curate, I had a difficult disease. It's called epididymitis, and some of you who are medically adept will know what it is, and for the others, I won't explain it. And I was in the hospital, and it was very painful, very painful. And someone who was assisting in the parish, Dean Borgman, who teaches at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, this was at Christ Church of Hamilton and Wenham in Massachusetts, he came to visit me in the hospital. And he just sat beside my bed. You could tell I was in pain, and his face reflected my pain. And that was sufficient. I can't remember anything he said, but he listened deeply to my story. I wasn't so much saying, I was just in pain. and that deeply touched me, such that story, you know, it's still with me, such that it arises today as I speak about this. So you're absolutely right. It's the other person's story that needs to be in charge. And we are, you know, are we listening to Jesus in that other person's story? Seeking, naming, and celebrating Jesus' loving presence in the stories of others. Thank you for that.
When you talked about verbalizing, helping you to better understand your own faith, talking about
Yes.
it just really struck a chord with me. I was a teacher for 40 years,
Ah,
more than 40
right.
years. And how many times I really came to understand the concept because I had to teach it or speak about it and answer questions about it. And then as an EFM mentor for 5 or 6 years, I realized that that was the time that was most productive for me in understanding what I believe, but I'd never put it together until you just said that. It really is clear.
As we pressure ourselves to articulate, we discover what we believe. Yeah.
And just quickly, are there people on Zoom that have questions or comments?
So thank you, Titus, for your theses. I hope you'll post them on our door or on the inside of our door as we head out. So just a amusing and then a question, you know, around this reluctance to talk about this. I think there is some fear, rightly so, around being called hypocrites. And when we look at the data of why young people, or all kinds of people, nuns and duns, are turned off by church, not necessarily by Jesus, but by church, the gathered ones, hypocrisy is one of them. And I think people, you know, hypocrisy is that wearing of masks and saying one thing and doing another. And I think people have some unease about that. And, you know, I live with 3 teenagers who are quick to call out hypocrisy, even when they practice it themselves. But, you know, it's a real fear. And I think part of being pastors to congregations is to help our people, help ourselves get over some of that and maybe just admit to it. Maybe that's what will release us of it. But, you know, the point on the abuse of evangelism, you know, when I felt it in myself when you were talking, it was like, you know, we need to go out and evangelize. And in my mind, that meant, you know, sort of lining up parishioners and giving them packets and handouts, and we're going to canvass the neighborhood. And our parishes actually talked about that. And we've done some of that with both mixed results. Of course, they're going to be mixed, and mixed experiences, from being welcome to, you know, having, you know, the door slammed in your face. Right. So I'd be interested in if you, or if there are others who have successful, like, case studies of parishes that have done evangelism effectively in the Episcopal Church. Because what we heard today, I mean, what Jerusalem beautifully did was one-on-one evangelism. What John's talking about, you know, in a hospital, one-on-one. That's me, you know, talking to, you know, my caretaker or something like that. But how about at a parish level? Are there some sort of less militant models for evangelizing? Didn't mean to offer you an
No. I immediately go to two experiences, one at St. Peter's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one at the Church of St. Simon the Cyrenian in New Rochelle, New York. I was rector of St. Peter's for 11 years and interim rector at St. Simon's, which, by the way, is a 100% African-American, Afro-Caribbean congregation. And in both places, I was able to catalyze neighborhood canvassing. And hats off that you've tried it here. Hats off. Okay. So we would go out, and in this case, it was only men going out, 2 by 2s. And it had an evangelistic intent, but it was under the cover of an invitation to church. That's the way I would put it. And this is what we would say. Hello, we'd knock on doors, literally. And Henry Soons, the senior warden at St. Peter's, who was African-American, and I would be there, and Henry would say, hello, I'm Henry Soons. I'm from St. Peter's, a couple blocks down the road. And we just want you to know we're there. And this is our pastor, Titus Presler. And is there something you'd like us to pray for at church this coming Sunday? That was our come on. And similar in the case of St. Simon the Cyrenian. And there we had, teams, 5 or 6 teams who would go out. And as you found, sometimes the door is slammed. Other times there's a polite but somewhat non-engaged reception. And sometimes there's, oh yeah, my aunt is on her deathbed, or my brother's going through a divorce, or I have a child who's sick, or something of that nature. And we'd write that down and pray for it the next Sunday and Sundays after. A few people came to church as a result of that, but not many. And so again, Lorenzo and David in the last session, where David in particular was saying, we often measure success in faulty, ill-conceived ways. And what was the success of that? We have no idea, actually. Was it a success or a failure? I mean, the purpose actually was not church growth, even though we were inviting them to church. As I say, it was evangelism under the cover of an invitation to church. So it didn't really matter whether anyone came to church or not. What happened in those people's lives? Did they begin to offer a prayer? Did they? I have no idea. We do these things and we offer them up to God. In terms of, and again, that's part of my, I don't have a, quote, successful example to cite, but that's because I don't know what success, I mean, talk with someone next door to you on an airplane, you're never going to see them again. You get into a faith conversation. That's sufficient in itself. And so also a parish effort to go out and share something of Jesus, or invite people, into conversations in which we're seeking, naming, and celebrating the presence of Jesus in their lives. That's sufficient in itself. And, it's like any kind of, evangelism, the measure is not conversion. That's not our objective. Our objective is simply witness. Jesus didn't say go out and convert. He said go out and be my witnesses. After 9/11, there was this great, and it's still present in the New York subway system. If you see something, say something. If you see something, say something. We have seen God at work in Christ Jesus in the cosmos. We need to say something about that. That's evangelism. It's not, if someone comes to Christ and becomes a Christian, that's the work of the Holy Spirit. It's not the work of John or Stefan or Susan or anybody. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. We shouldn't be trying to make that happen. We are simply called to be God's witnesses, Christ's witnesses. And if something comes of that, thanks be to God. If something doesn't come of that, I don't know, because I don't know how to define something not coming of that. Something may come of it. You know, I recommitted my life to Christ as a young adult. I was 24, 25, something like that. And I recall, in retrospect, hiking around Mount Rainier on the Wonderland Trail. Has anyone ever done that? It's a 90-mile hike around Mount Rainier. And, you know, I grew up in India. I've hiked in Nepal. I hiked in the Himalayas, blah, 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 blah. Mount Rainier is the most beautiful place on earth that I have experienced in August, with the wildflowers hiking up these ridges and then the meadows and then down into the glacial, blah, blah, blah. My friend pulled his a tendon halfway through and left, and I continued the hike. On my last night, I was at a camp, and there was this middle-aged couple, and there was a campfire, and I joined them, and I cooked my dinner and they cooked their dinner, and we got to talking. Well, they had the 4 spiritual laws with them. Bill Bright's 4 spiritual laws, okay, Campus Crusade for Christ. And they testified to me. They bore witness to me. And at the age of 19, I didn't pay that any mind. I went my way. Was that effective in my life? Was it one little drop in the ocean of experience that later brought me to a committed relationship with Christ? Maybe. You know, I dismissed it, discarded it at the time, but maybe it had a role. I don't know.
You didn't forget it.
I did. That's right. I didn't forget it. Right.
We've got 2 more here.
So what you just said about how you can't know the effects of your actions when you were going door to door, 2 by 2. I had an interesting experience on Wednesday. Our son was hospitalized on Monday by the police for behavioral issues, which he has. He's 29. And we were going to pick him up. And my husband, who's an atheist, was saying that he wanted to talk to my rector about prayer. And he said, ever since he was a young man, he has not believed in God, because how could the Holocaust happen? And how could this young woman, who was the sister of his girlfriend at the time, die from breast cancer with 4 children while nursing her youngest? And everyone was praying for her at the time, and people were praying during the Holocaust. And yet these bad things happened. And I said, well, you should talk to Mark about it. You should definitely have this conversation. I know he would love to speak with you about it. And then I shared with him my experience of prayer, being prayed for when I was walking the Camino of Santiago de Compostela 2 years ago, less than a year after I'd regained my mobility, period, after foot surgery. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to do this, but I knew that a lot of friends and family and parishioners were all praying for me, which I certainly felt. And some of them articulated it, some didn't, but I felt it anyway. And I frequently pray for people, and sometimes they die, but it doesn't mean that the prayer had no effect. I can't know the effect. I know that there is an effect for sure, but I don't know all of the ways that it can manifest. And I said, you know, people are praying for our son all the time. And I certainly am. And maybe that is what keeps him alive. Or I really don't know, but there are so many ways. And anyway, it's sort of similar to what you were saying, going door to door.
Yeah.
You can't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Susan. Thank you for sharing that. That's so hard. And what comes to mind is, what is our spirituality? What is it? Is it some instrumentality? I don't think so. And I think that's where we go down a rabbit hole if we think that being a Christian, being, well, I'm going to use the term spirituality, our Christian spirituality, is it the means to an end? It shouldn't be. It can't be. It mustn't be. Our Christian spirituality is entering into a mystery. We don't know how God works, but we do know that God works. We can't slice and dice it precisely, but we know that God is at work. The Bible testifies to that. People's lives testify to that. Our own experience testifies to that. But we can't, it's very difficult to make, A caused B. And when we try to do that, we're betraying ourselves into a kind of modern technological instrumentality, an instrumental approach to Christian spirituality. And if we're faithful to the fact of mystery, then I think we're being faithful.
Linda, we see you. We'll be with you in just one moment.
Okay.
I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Titus, for the presentation. I was just thinking about what you were saying in terms of almost the question of success, with our evangelism, our ability to go out there and how to quantify it. And there is really no way to see how that affect, how our proclaiming of Christ has an effect on the people that we proclaim to. I believe that's true. I mean, there are all sorts of things that happen in those intimate conversations or those large conversations in church and as we share our story. But I do know, one thing I do know is when I share my story, my relationship with Christ, my story, it deepens my own relationship. Well, it helps me to remember, reclaim, to articulate, to press forward, to help people understand what I know. And that opens up a lot of things for me, myself, and then hopefully even a deeper conversation with those that I'm engaging in conversation with, right? I think I love what you said about the first part of our presentation or this day is about how, and you're talking about the why it's necessary for the articulation. I love that. It's a beautiful thing. I think what I think the thing I'm struggling with is how to create moments so that my parishioners who aren't ordained can share their story. How to create moments so that they don't have to worry about being prejudiced or discriminated against, or in some way that or how do I create a situation so that they could feel confident to share what they know is true and authentic in their relationship with Christ, and that would be enough.
I'm put in mind of the 2018 convention of the diocese that had the theme of evangelism, and Stephanie Spellers was the keynote speaker, and Jeremy Hackett was also there, the digital evangelist for the Episcopal Church. And a couple of, actually 3 or 4 of us on the Green Mountain Witness team ran workshops at that, simply inviting people to share their faith in the context of some particularly constructed hypothetical situations that we offered to them. And people found that very helpful, just to, have 2 minutes to share their faith. We've done that in a joint workshop between St. Matthew's Enosburg and Grace Church Sheldon. And people similarly found it helpful and edifying. But I think it takes a lot of repetition. It takes a lot of practice. I think Jerusalem said something about that this morning, vis-a-vis, practicing to learn to play an instrument. And so we need practice in learning to play the instrument of our faith, the musical instrument of our faith. And that's what this morning's exercises were all about. Yeah.
Time for one more, please.
Okay.
Linda.
We have one too, so
Oh.
Linda and then Doug.
Oh, okay. Yep. Linda.
Hi, Titus.
Hi, Linda.
I think we have slipping away from us, but we have a moment here that we could latch onto. In the last few years, I've been encountering some people who've asked me, well, what's the Episcopal Church about? And I say, so did you watch the royal wedding? That guy is our elected leader. We try to be like that. I think if we had that video and we could just say, here, let me share this video with you. Then you'll see what the Episcopal Church is about. At least we'd like to be. And you also might tell people about the example of the Holy Apostles in New York.
Want to say a word about that?
Well, Holy Apostles is a sort of midtown church. And some years back, the folks there saw some people in the park across the way who looked really miserable and hungry, and they invited them over to have a meal. And the next thing you knew, they were running the largest soup kitchen in New York City. They got a lot of donations from other churches that didn't want to have to do that. Well, some years into that, they decided to do some renovations in the church, and we were almost finished when a fire broke out on the roof and gutted the interior. Now, the soup kitchen was closed for one day and then went right back on. It happened on Good Friday, by the way. And by Easter Sunday, they decided they would rebuild. And they did all kinds of creative things. But then they had the big discussion, shall we have pews or chairs in the new church? And they decided to have chairs. And then they realized what else they could do. So from that time on, instead of having only 7 minutes to eat a meal or whatever, people go into the adjacent building and get their trays. And then they go through a passage into the church where big round tables are set up for them, where they can eat their meal at their leisure. And if they want more, they can go around and get another one, no charge. And there they sit dining before the altar, and the volunteers come around with beverages and dessert. And that, to me, is the church in action, and getting the word out on that place is worth having. Garrison Keillor has spoken about it in some of his writings.
Thank you, Linda. And by the way, Linda is associated with St. Matthew's in Enosburg, and Beth Crane is the senior warden of Grace Church in Sheldon, down at the bottom. Yeah, Michael Curry's sermon at the royal wedding was great. but it was a mild form of Michael Curry. What I commend to you in terms of the white hot combination of fantastically zealous preaching and profound theology was Michael's sermon at the revival at the 2018 General Convention in Austin, Texas. That is a remarkable artifact, and it's still readily available. You're nodding your head, John. It's just an absolutely thrilling, I mean, there's all of his oratory, his humor, his energy, and the sweat flying and all of that. And at the same time, absolutely compelling, wonderfully articulated theology. Just a marvel, a marvel.
The person sitting next to me, who I had invited to come, was in tears.
Yeah.
Young woman was
Yeah.
sitting next to me in tears.
You
at
were
that.
in Austin?
I was.
Yeah. Yeah. It was quite something. And of course, it went on for, I don't know, an hour.
Who was counting?
Yeah, who was counting?
Can I just say thank you, Titus, for moving us from the head, actually, to our, not to our heart, but to our soul. You brought us to a beautiful mystical place. So
Oh, thank you.
very much.
So